This is Christopher James with the Regulatory Assistance Project. Carl Linvill, also a principal, will be the presenter for today's webinar on countering the reliability card. We are recording today's session for those who are unable to join us. The session will be available on RAP's website. We have had over 300 registrants, so we will have your phone muted during the presentation. If you do have questions, please type them into the questions pane, and then we will be able to see them and answer them during the webinar. We will pause during the presentation for clarifying questions. For example, if you would like clarification on one of the slides, or if you would like further explanation of something Carl said, again, then you would type that into the questions pane. For any other questions, though, please hold them for the Q&A session that we'll have at the end of the webinar. Since we do have a lot of people on the line, and we also expect a lot of questions, we will remain on the line for up to another half an hour following the end of the official portion of this webinar for further discussion. Today's topic on countering the reliability card is critical in light of EPA's Clean Power Plan. And the quote you see, I think, is quite relevant to many of us, many of the listeners. We want to frame this topic as not only that clean energy is generally helpful to reliability, as Carl will establish, but also that given the contemporary issue of 111D and the discussion of many that 111D will impair reliability, the ability of clean, non- or low-carbon energy to help reliability renders today's topic very timely. This quote from Consumers Energy Senior Vice President is from an interview that he gave on a Michigan radio station, and I think it's really quite insightful, showing that it's really an opportunity for the state of Michigan because we are going to change out our older plants and build the next generation of clean burning power plants while investing in renewable energy. He also went on to say that it's really not cost effective from his perspective to retrofit the older plants. And he believes that this is true not only for utilities in Michigan, but around the Midwest. So I want to introduce myself. I am principal with the Regulatory Assistance Project. My background is primarily as an air regulator. I was head of Connecticut's air program for many years and worked for EPA regional office prior to that. I also was the state representative to Connecticut's Energy Efficiency Board. Dr. Carl Linvill is a principal at RAP. Carl's work focuses on distributed generation planning and tariffs, resource planning, and regional transmission planning. His experience includes being an academic economist, utility commissioner, and an energy advisor to Governor Gwynne in Nevada. Carl, it's your show now.
Thank you, Chris. Sorry for the little delay in getting myself off of mute. Thanks for that great introduction. So today we're going to be talking about countering the reliability card. A few months ago, I thought of this question that I started asking everyone I met at NERUC meetings and NASIO meetings and different places that we go to talk around the country. Start asking, when have you had a utility play a reliability card? When has an issue come up where you were told that you absolutely could not pursue a clean energy policy, for example, because it would compromise reliability, and there you were, with the argument framed as we can't do these really beneficial clean energy things because there's a fundamental reliability flaw. And not surprisingly, everyone I talk to has an example of where this has happened to them. No matter where you go in the country, no matter what perspective they're coming from, regulators, staff, consumer advocates, everybody has stories about reliability cards. One thing I hope you'll take away from today's webinar is to carry this question with you, to ask it, and to get people to think about when reliability cards have been played, and to think about whether they turned out to be legitimate or not. So today what we're going to start with is just describing reliability, what these reliability cards are, what hands of cards you might have available to counter reliability plays. And then I'm going to provide a couple of fairly extreme examples where a reliability card was played and it turned out to really not be true, and and I'm sure we can, and I also enumerate several others without going into detail. Then we're going to transition into talking about the Clean Power Plan. One of the purposes of the call today is to help all of you who are on the phone just as you prepare for these upcoming FERC technical conferences on the Clean Power Plan and reliability. We don't have the answer to every question, but we do think we have some ways of thinking about the relationship between the Clean Power Plan and reliability that we think will be helpful to you. And then finally, we're going to kind of leave section 2 with the thought that the Clean Power Plan is really just a first attempt at quantifying the cost of carbon on existing power plants. It's a modest step, and actually it lays on the path that many states are already on, and not even at the end point that states have laid out, but somewhere along the transition path. And so then we're going to go from there to examples from highly regarded technical experts where they have shown that low carbon paths that are much more aggressive than the Clean Power Plan can be reliable. So first, to step back on reliability, I like this slide a lot, and I hope you'll hang on to it and use it. It just breaks down, one of the first challenges you face when somebody plays a reliability card is, well, what do they really mean by reliability? Some people will claim that, nearly closing a power plant or some number of power plants compromises reliability in and of itself. Well, that's not per se a reliability issue. Reliability issues are things like, is the supply adequate to meet demand? Those are adequacy concerns. Does the system operate well under normal operating conditions? Is it able to adjust supply and demand to keep balance and keep frequency in normal operating conditions? And does it respond really well when a disturbance hits the system? If reliability is protected under all three of those circumstances, as being adequate for planning purposes, as operating reliably in normal operating conditions, and in meeting those disturbances in unusual conditions where stress is placed upon the system, then that system is said to be reliable. So I think the first thing you should do, and I have these things listed here on this slide. I just want to point out that this grouping of things was recommended by Brian Parsons, formerly with National Renewable Energy Lab and now with Western Grid Group. And there's some really fine presentations by Deborah Liu, also formerly with NREL, now with General Electric, that you can find on the Western Interstate or Western YRAB website. And I will post that, how you get to those after this presentation. So, so the first step in countering a reliability card is figuring out what card is being played and getting specific about that. The second piece in countering reliability card is to think about what hands you have that may be appropriate for countering the card being played. It depends on the resources available. It depends on the flexibility that already exists in the electric system. It depends upon what changes in operational practices can be feasibly implemented. But no matter what location you're in, it's almost surely true that there are a number of hands that can be played. There's one point I want to make at this point. I'm giving you a broad overview. Different electric systems in the country are different, and a necessary part of countering the reliability card well and figuring out what hand to play in your region is to get to know your friendly local electric engineer and system planners. There's some good people in every location around the country that can help you to interpret this stuff for your specific circumstances. You know, we certainly will do our best as well, but at the end of the day, you know, one of the most effective things that I've seen utilities do is take advantage of a lack of knowledge of their specific system by a technical expert. And so vetting what you plan to say and what you're going to do with someone who really knows that your electric system well is a really good thing to do. So there's this nice chart. There have been many things like this that have been created over the last several years. This one was taken from a publication called Flexibility in the 21st Century Power System from last year. It's an NREL publication. I included it partly because it's notable that there's a co-author on this is EPRI, who has, you know, good credentials on the utility side of the community. So I think it's a good one to pull out to show the range of tools that are in the toolbox. There are tools here, system operation tools, tools that relate to the supply side, both fossil resource tools as well as renewable energy, you know, large-scale renewable energy tools. And then, of course, there's the customer side, the customer resource side of tools that are available, like demand response, local storage, local generation, things like that. There's also changes in market design that can be useful. So there's a wide range of tools. The tools that are appropriate to the card that's played depend upon the reliability issue that's being raised and the capabilities of the system in which you're operating. So, so this is your kind of toolbox of all the possible things that you can put together to respond to a reliability card. So now I just want to give a couple examples. You know, I think it's important to point out that playing a reliability card, asserting that reliability will be compromised is not in and of itself a case, or asserting that power plants will close, or that baseload power plants will close, or that a number of baseload power plants will close is not in and of itself proof that there are reliability implications. There's some really clear examples from the past where assertions have been made that have been proven false. This first one I want to go through, you know, is the real classic, kind of the gold standard, and boy, were we wrong on that one. So, you know, load growth was rapid and through the 50s, 60s. In the 1970s, you know, it was presumed that the approximately 7% load growth that had been happening in the 2 decades leading up to that period would continue for the foreseeable future. There were large baseload additions proposed in this time frame that were said to be necessary to ensure reliability. In this case, the assertion was a resource adequacy assertion, that we just simply won't have enough supply to meet the demand. What actually happened was that reduced consumption ensured reliability than far less generation that was projected to be needed. Here's a really interesting quote from the RAND Corporation from 1972, where the bottom line of RAND's study in this case was that electricity use has been doubling every 8 to 10 years. It's going to continue doubling every 8 to 10 years. And this means that in California, they're going to need approximately 40 nuclear power plants. This inspired quite a response. And what we saw was that 40 nuclear power plants were not needed, not anywhere close to 40 nuclear power plants were needed. And in fact, California set out on a path of controlling load growth, as many other places in the country did as well, to where this projected demand and this doubling every 8 to 10 years was confounded and did not turn out. So the lights stayed on. 40 nuclear power plants were not built. There's only a couple of nuclear power plants left operating in California today. The lights are staying on today. Boy, was that one wrong. Now, another one, that, and this is one that I, personally confronted when I was a commissioner in Nevada, and our utility at that time was asserting, this was in the early 2000s, about 2004, that the most wind that could be accommodated in northern Nevada was 50 megawatts. And going beyond 50 megawatts would require a substantial investment in additional firming generation. 50 megawatts on a 2,000 megawatt system is about 2.5% of load. It's about, if you do the energy calculation, it's about 1 to 1.5% of the energy. We've seen since that time that installed capacities are quite a bit larger than 1.5 or 1% of generation. Certainly not everywhere, but the lights are staying on in all of these places that are listed on this chart here. And here we are seeing penetrations, much larger than those very low levels. There are lots of examples that we could go on and on with this about. One that comes up in a number of places is with the net metering conversation right now is fear about distributed generation penetration levels that are very low. I mean, in places where there's essentially no distributed generation, the utility or others will sometimes say, well, we can't keep net metering, or we can't allow distributed generation to run wild because it'll compromise reliability. We found that even the 15% limit on any circuit that was in the interconnection standard, IEEE's former interconnection standard that's being updated at this point and already has been updated in California, 15% on any circuit was far too modest. So, and there are others that we list here as well, and I'm sure you could come up with others, and I encourage you to do that. I don't want to say that reliability is not vital. Reliability is vital. It's a matter of public health and safety. Reliability limits do exist that need to be paid attention to. And they are location specific. So again, the advice about being friends with your local electrical engineer, power system engineer, experts is very important. But the reality is that playing the card, playing the assertion, has not always manifested itself as a problem, and in some cases, and sometimes, as we've just discussed, it's been dramatically wrong. it's also been tempting in the past to play the reliability card without considering what I call a full palette of options. A couple of minutes ago, I put up that toolbox of all of the different tools available to ensure reliability on the system, on the customer side, on the demand side, on the supply side, from renewable resources, from markets. Often, many of those cards are left in the deck and never brought out into play. Often, we're told, well, the only thing we can do in the face of a closing baseload power plant is to build another baseload power plant, and maybe it needs to be gas. Well, that's not true. There are many options, and we just simply have to not let people get away with making these lazy assertions that don't have not evaluated the full palette of options. So let's start talking about the Clean Power Plan here for a minute. What have we heard being asserted relative to the Clean Power Plan? Well, the issues in FERC's National Meeting Technical Conference, scheduled for next week on the 19th, they posed a number of questions. They chose these three categories for the questions. And they asked people to comment, does the Clean Power Plan impose operational issues? Does it affect infrastructure investment? And does it cause market issues? From the outset, the one thing that's kind of troubling about all of these questions, they did not use the word problems, they used the word issues, but there certainly is a connotation of an issue being a problem. As the quote that Chris read early on stated from Michigan, this is not only a potential issue area or problem area, this is also an opportunity. Most conventional generation is approaching the end of its operating life in this country. There's going to be a large investment in new generation, no matter which future we follow going forward. This is an opportunity to make smart operational choices, smart investment choices, to build the right infrastructure, to build the right facilitating market mechanisms like those that allow customer resources to fairly participate. This is an opportunity. It's not just an issue or a problem or a threat. It's an opportunity, and it's probably, probably the biggest threat is that we will spend money on the wrong things now. And one of the best ways to spend money on the wrong things is to spend money on the same things that were built 20 years ago, because clearly technology has changed and public policy has changed and operational capabilities have changed. So given all of that and given these assertions, what do we have to say? Well, let's take a step back and look at this question. We're already in a low carbon transition. Everywhere regulators acknowledge reliability is essential. And the real question is, how are we going to ensure reliability at least cost? I want to say that the Clean Power Plan is just a modest step in the transition where we're beginning to recognize the cost of carbon on existing power plants. So the real question, I think, is, does this initial recognition of carbon's cost endanger reliability? Well, this chart is taken from a Clean Power Plan document. I have the citation there, so you can look it up if you'd like. And it enumerates the generation targets that are implicit in the renewable energy building block of the Clean Power Plan for each of these regions in the country. We can compare them to existing RPS targets. This is taken from the same EPA document. This is not the complete list. I didn't thought I was straining your eyes enough to include this much of it. But the basic point I want to make here is, again, contrasting these targets here with this list of what are already established policies makes it evident, I think, that the Clean Power Plan is on the path towards meeting state goals that are already in place in many places. Now, this is not true everywhere, and we have to be careful on a state-by-state basis. But generally, for the country at large, I think the Clean Power Plan goals are on the path towards compliance, not a dramatic deviation from the path that most people are already on. This is a nice little technical report from the Western Electric Coordinating Council staff. This is a preliminary report, which means that it was prepared by staff. It's not been adopted by the board of directors of the Western Electric Coordinating Council. But you can pull out some information that just comes out of data that are, in the plan, and we can contrast what RPS targets do we see in different states in the WEC planning numbers relative to what EPA is incorporating into their building blocks. So this is just another look at that data we looked at a minute ago. And you can see, again, that in most of these places, with a couple of exceptions, these RPS targets are at or exceed the EPA targets, or EPA assumptions. Likewise with energy efficiency incorporated into the Western Electric Coordinating Council documents reflects detailed work done by Lawrence Berkeley National Lab to look at the energy efficiency policies and requirements of states and ensure that they're reflected in 2024 planning numbers. So these green bars are those energy efficiency standards or goals that already exist for states. And once again, we go across and look at the energy efficiency built into the as a building block to establish those numbers, and compare it with the LBNL estimate of what's already in state policy, and we'll see in most cases it's at, close to, or below what's already being planned. So I'm going to just pause at this point and ask if there are any clarifying questions that people want to ask before we go to the third and final part of this presentation. Chris, are there any questions?
Yes, Carl. I received two questions that I guess you can decide whether they're clarifying or maybe hold, but they both relate to slide number 10. And the questions are, one is, if storage is so expensive, why is it receiving so much attention? And then the second question on the same slide is, what is the significance of the order of options shown? Both the order of the intervention and what's described in each. Is there any significance to that?
Okay. Yeah, those are good questions. I'll take the second one first. So these are ordered by range of costs, right? So changes in system operations that don't require investment in new equipment or substantial, investments can be very low-cost modifications. And you'll notice that each of these things has a wide bar. And so it's not that things from the storage bar might not be cost effective. They may be the right solution for the situation that you're facing. And you can see that the lower part of that storage bar is, not as low as basically no cost operational improvements, but can be competitive with some operational improvements. So, the significance of the order going across is just, I think, this is an NREL document. I think they were ordering it in a way to emphasize, the lowest cost, basically the low-hanging fruit things that can be done first, and proceeded to the right. But as I said, the bars are also significant. The distance from the bottom to the top of the cost is significant. And while something like storage may look like the most expensive option, it may be the right option for the reliability challenge that you face. Finally, with regard to storage being expensive, the cost of storage is coming down. It may be, in some places, the least cost tool. There's this interesting area in between demand response and storage of things where you use the thermal energy, things like water heaters or cooled warehouses or air conditioning with ice storage. Are those technologies demand response, or are they storage? I think, I would argue that those things may be a little bit overpriced conceptually if that is intended to be encompassed in thermal storage on the far right here. I would argue some of that storage is very cost effective right now. And finally, I would say that storage being an evolving technology, we've seen in the past. I mean, who would have predicted what's happened to the cost of solar today? Actually, people did predict it, but most people would not believe 10 years ago that PV, photovoltaics, would be so inexpensive today. Those who are leading in implementing storage today are paving the way for implementation of technologies that will become more cost-effective over time. So, for one, some thermal storage I think could be deployed today as a very cost-effective option. Storage that's more expensive today will become less expensive over time, and I think we owe a debt of gratitude to those who stepped forward in developing that technology so it moves down that cost curve and development curve. So I probably said more than I should have as a clarifying question there, but I care about all that stuff.
And Carl, there were two other really quick questions. What was the, on slide 24, what are the units of the y-axis? Is that megawatt hours or megawatts or?
That is a very good question. Let me see. 90 megawatts, and I believe it's in megawatts for the renewable. I'm sorry, I don't have that in front of me. I should apologize for that. I'll clarify that afterwards. Energy efficiency is always quantified in megawatt hours. RPS standards are almost always in megawatt hours. So I would say they're probably, these are in actually in gigawatt hours, so that would be, so California's energy efficiency goal would be about 27 terawatt hours. Yeah, I think that's probably correct. And California's renewable goal would be, 92 terawatt hours. That sounds in the ballpark to me. Okay. Anything else, Chris, or should we move on?
You can move on.
Okay, great. And so, it's interesting to see. I think, what I intend to establish in this part of the presentation that we're just now leaving is that the Clean Power Plan is just on a path towards meeting many of the targets that are already in place. And the next question, might be, well, how high can we go? What renewable energy levels can be attained without significant reliability problems? And the purpose of this question is to establish that, again, these Clean Power Plan goals are really modest goals. And that a number of studies by highly qualified folks have found that much higher renewable energy penetration levels can be reliably incorporated in the system. There's a citation to a study that we did about a year ago, Clean Keeps the Lights On, that provides a little bit more detail about the studies that I am going to review here. And so I encourage you to look at that if you have more questions. This is a partial list of the folks that have looked at this question. There are more recent studies that I didn't include in this list. These are the ones that are included in the Clean Keeps the Lights On paper. But you can see respected research institutions, very respected consultants, a variety of agencies, advocates, reliability operators have funded these things. So we're not just picking from the list extreme examples of folks that have performed studies. We're really looking at really excellent technical capabilities funded by different types of entities. One of the studies that we look at a little bit is the study done, commissioned by PJM, looking at 30% variable energy in the PJM footprint. PJM did commission this study. GE Energy Consulting and some other folks performed it. The study notes that in 2011, about 2% of renewable energy, of all energy, gigawatt hours of energy, came from renewable energy. By 2026, existing goals have this landing at about 14% for the PJM footprint. The study commissioned by PJM asked the question, what happens if we get up to 30% of variable renewable energy on our system? Can we maintain reliability in that circumstance? And this is a direct quote taken from the study. The study findings indicate that the PJM system, with adequate transmission expansion and additional regulating reserves, will not have any significant issues operating up to 30% of its energy provided by wind and solar generation. So reliability is not a question. Some expenses may be required. They note the need for some additional transmission and some additional regulating reserves. There are different ways of getting those regulating reserves, as the chart of options up above noted. So, for example, storage is available as an option for getting regulating reserves. There's a really good publication by NREL on wind energy with active controls that makes it clear that wind energy can be used to provide many system services that help to support reliability. So yes, some investment may be necessary, but there aren't any significant reliability issues, up to 30% provided by wind and solar. Second study I want to talk about just briefly was commissioned by Texas Clean Energy Coalition. Some 2032 scenarios were prepared by the Brattle Group. Texas has more than 12,000 megawatts of wind today. The study examined wind expansions from 4 to 46,000 megawatts, solar expansions from 6 to 13,000 megawatts, and gas expansions from 50 to 65,000 megawatts. The coal fleet was, in these scenarios, ranged from not changing to there being an 80% reduction in the energy coming from coal generation. The study said, the study conclusion was, our models found no technical difficulties accommodating much higher levels of variable wind and solar energy while fully preserving reliability. Now, there may be other ways to fully preserve reliability than relying on as much gas as we relied on in this study. But I think the overall point that reliability, that you can achieve reliability with much higher penetrations of wind and solar is an important one. The Western Wind and Solar Integration Study was commissioned by NREL, performed by NREL, GE Energy Solutions, and others. They had help from others. They looked at 35% penetration of wind and solar in the what's called the West Connect footprint, which is southwestern and on through Colorado footprint. And this is a statement taken from that study. The technical analysis performed in this study shows that it's feasible for the West Connect region to accommodate 30% wind and 5% solar energy penetration. This requires key changes to current practice, including substantial balancing area cooperation, sub-hourly scheduling, and access to underutilized transmission. So their proposal for the pieces of the toolbox that are needed to accommodate these 35% levels come from that left-hand category of stuff having to do with evolution in operations practices. There are many more studies that have found similar conclusions. The Minnesota Renewable Energy Integration and Transmission Study looked at 40% renewable energy in Minnesota and found that reliability could be maintained at 40% renewable energy penetration. The National Renewable Energy Lab is a part of something called the Low Carbon Grid Study and did perform something called the Renewable Energy Futures Study. Both studies look at much higher penetrations of renewable energy, higher than 40%, and the Renewable Energy Futures Study, as you're probably familiar with, looked up to 80%. Now, when you get to some threshold, there are investments required. You become dependent on making some of those changes that are in the toolbox that were described up on whatever slide that was, slide 10, I think it was. But again, these studies are finding that reliability can be maintained with much higher penetrations of renewable energy. The 2050 roadmap for the EU, similarly, the Eastern Wind Integration and Transmission Study, E3's study, beyond 33% in California, found that very modest curtailment would be experienced at 40% renewable energy penetration. Low Carbon Grid Study believes that even less of an issue arises going to 40 to 51% in California. And then just recently, actually in February of this year, the U.S. Department of Energy commissioned a study that looked at the natural gas infrastructure implications of increased demands, both from generation and from use of natural gas, with prices being much lower today, and identified that the investments necessary to ensure adequate supply of natural gas being delivered to where it's needed call for investments that are below historical levels. So in other words, the annual investment for the next 10 years of building the system to accommodate whatever increased use is necessary requires expenditures that are below historical averages, which is very interesting. So to wrap up, I hope what we've shown is that, reliability is a legitimate issue. It should not be dismissed. It should be taken very seriously. It should be considered as a local issue. So these studies are wonderful for showing that in different places of the country, we're finding high penetrations can be achieved. But you also have to tailor those messages to your local situation, interact with some folks that are very familiar with your local situation. These hands that are available to counter the reliability card are numerous, as the chart on page 10 showed. Putting together the right cards to play first requires that you get clarity from the entity in question, whether it's a utility, a balancing area operator, or an RTO operator of a system. So you get clarity from them on what is exactly the reliability issue that's at stake. What are the problems that are being asserted in a more specific way, and then to tailor your response to those cards that can help to counteract that issue. The Clean Power Plan is just an initial recognition of carbon's cost. It's a modest recognition, and in many states, policy requirements already have states on a path that is more aggressive than the Clean Power Plan. And finally, Clean Power Plan targets are modest compared to what experts, highly respected experts like the Brattle Group and GE Energy Solutions, National Renewable Energy Lab, have found are possible without compromising reliability. So I guess with that, Chris, I will turn it back to you for questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Carl. While questions are coming in, I guess just what struck me from your presentation is that utility planners, regional transmission organizations are used to dealing with uncertainty all the time, have been for the past decades. And what you're saying is that the provisions under the Clean Power Plan, how you express them, are really a little different than many of the uncertainty and actions that have occurred over the past 20, 30 years, and it's really no different than what they're used to doing. Is that kind of an accurate assessment?
Yeah, yes, I believe that's true. That system operators have, systems were designed to accommodate variability in demand, to accommodate the possibility of power plants failing. System operators have been assessing reliability of systems for decades. And the Clean Power Plan implementation represents a transition in the portfolio of resources that are being used to ensure reliability. They're, acknowledging there are some sources of variability that are newer for system operators to deal with and to get used to, like the variability in variable energy resources. But there's not really much that's more variable than responding to a huge nuclear power plant shutting off and having to react to that. So,
Right.
so these guys have been dealing with these basic issue for a long time.
Great. Okay. So I've got a number of questions here, and some have sort of similar topic. So let's see. Well, okay. we had a number of questions on renewable energy, and some of your examples cover that. So let's go to that one. What about the duck curve? Person asked about that, and I think that particularly gets into some of the deep renewables and perhaps some of the deep efficiency that is being covered by some of the states. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. So, so I'm going to assume that everybody is familiar with the duck curve. So the duck curve represents a modification in the demand for electricity from supply based on increasing adoption of distributed generation of solar energy that has a load shape that follows, the sun, and increased energy efficiency. So the result of those higher levels, and first of all, let's be clear that when we see the duck curve, there are much higher levels of distributed generation and much higher levels of dependence on solar than what is experienced, virtually everywhere in the country today. So first of all, let's disabuse the notion that the duck curve is an issue for everyone today. If your solar adoption rates are low, you're not going to see a duck curve type situation happening for a long time. But in a place like Southern California, where large nuclear power plant was closed, coastal thermal power plants are being closed. So there's a large gap in generation, a large change in how electricity is flowing on the Southern California system. And at the same time, there are pretty significant investments in distributed generation that lead to this situation of, the peak not happening at 4 or 5 o'clock, but the peak dropping a lot in the middle of the day and maybe being elevated slightly at the end of the day after the sun has gone down. So there are kind of 4 operational issues that come up, but I'm not going to name each one, but relative to the duck curve. But the basic response when somebody raises a duck curve is, first of all, is it relevant for your situation? I mean, are you looking at a situation where you have really high solar penetration? If the answer is no, then it's not a valid reliability card for somebody to be playing in your location. If the answer is yes, then the next question is, what tools from that toolbox that we showed on slide 10 can be brought into play? And so Jim Lazar from RAP wrote this really good paper on teaching the duck to fly. Lots of people have weighed in California on local solutions and regional solutions to modifying the load shape to mitigate the challenges, and as well as using resources in ways that they haven't been used before. So, for example, one of the solutions noted in teaching the duck to fly is to change the orientation of solar panels to be pointing west instead of pointing south, which extends production into some of the evening hours where the severe ramping is noted on the duck curve. Another is the use of some kind of storage, whether it's thermal storage or other kinds of storage. Another solution that's pulled out of the toolbox is regional cooperation. We know that accommodating high levels of renewables, whether it's a duck curve situation where it's very high solar penetration or a different situation, is benefited by having a larger pool of resources come into play that have complementary production shapes. So in the Western Interconnection, we have winds that blows at different times around the interconnection. We have the sun that sets at different times as you go from east to west. And we have resources that already exist that can be brought into play. So a good question in addressing the duck curve is, has our utility or system operator taken advantage of all of the regional resources that are available? Have they taken advantage of all the customer resources of incorporating demand response and storage? Have they implemented imaginative rate design solutions and policies that modify the load shape or attract supply at the times when you need it, of the sorts that you need? And in that way, we believe the duck curve can be cost effectively addressed.
Great. Thank you very much, Carl. That question sort of embraced 5 or 6 similar ones. So I think that was an excellent way to deal with a number of similar questions that we got from the audience. Recognizing that for many of you, you had allowed an hour for this webinar, I want to turn it back to Carl to briefly sum up his key points. And then, as we did mention at the beginning, Carl and I are willing and available to stay on for up to another half hour to answer other questions that came in, as well as others that you have. So Carl, why don't you sum up, and then we can let those go who need to, and then we can stay on for a more informal session.
Great, thanks, Chris. So again, the okay. Again, I have a fundamental issue with the way that this discussion about reliability and the Clean Power Plan is being framed. I think it's very important that we remember that we're already in a low-carbon transition. Everyone acknowledges reliability is essential, and everyone is seeking to figure out how to ensure reliability at least cost as we make our way through the low-carbon transition. The Clean Power Plan is just a very modest step in the transition, where we begin to recognize the cost of carbon associated with existing power plants. And what we've shown in this webinar is, in fact, that modest step towards a low-carbon future does not appear to compromise reliability. It's more modest in many places than state goals that are already being implemented. It's far more modest than studies produced by some of the best technical minds in the country have shown can be achieved reliably. So I want to believe that this initial recognition of carbon's cost endangers reliability. We appreciate the quote that was made at the beginning that Chris showed us, that this is really an opportunity. We're on the transition. We have a lot of aged power plants and infrastructure. We're going to be investing hundreds of billions of dollars over the next 20 years. Nationwide, more than $1 billion over the next 20 years, regardless of what path we take. We should be thinking about, what's the best way to spend that investment. And in keeping us on the path towards the transition, the Clean Power Plan is helpful. It's providing an opportunity for us to make progress in the right direction, and we appreciate it. So thank you very much for joining us. And as Chris said, we're going to hang on. For those of you who are leaving, thanks for coming, and feel free to contact us. For those who want to stay on, you're welcome, and we'll resume with more questions in just a moment. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Carl. And we have received a number of other questions here. trying to, hold on a second here. With the screen, okay, here we go. So one question we can easily answer is, people ask about, can we email the charts? Yes, absolutely. Normally those are posted on our website, so that's absolutely. Okay, so here's one. Carl, conclusions on reliability seem consistent with other analyses. Do you see exceptions to the general conclusions in particular states? For example, differences between West Coast states from national patterns.
Chris, I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you try to rephrase it for me?
Well, let me see. I just read it verbatim. So it could be, okay, maybe it's to the point that are there differences in reliability when you look at the different sizes of geographic regions, in other words, regional versus a particular state?
Oh, yeah. So, I'll try to, hopefully I answer your question. And if I don't, then feel free to ask another one. But yeah, I mean, the regional cooperation is an outstanding strategy. Some of the operational measures, I'm going to bring up the slide 10 again here, just because I think it's good for people to look at. Some of these measures which make the system more reliable are in fact directly connected to the size of the footprint of the system. So, and the point I was just making a minute ago in responding to the duck curve, but also in responding to many reliability challenges, there's an opportunity to take advantage of regional resources. And so building a regional capabilities that allow states to share resources, to purchase resources from each other. Things like, in the West, the energy imbalance market has been helpful in intra-hour exchanges in between Pacific Core and the California ISO. But so yes, larger balancing areas is a great thing. More balancing areas, larger footprint is a great way to accommodate more renewables, both because renewables are complementary in different places, so you can use that complementarity to reach higher renewable penetrations, and also you can provide, to the extent you have shortages in certain system services at particular points in time, you can draw upon that larger pool to meet those without having to undertake more local investment. If your question was more aimed towards the West Coast versus other parts of the country, then the answer is, of course, different places in the country have different resources, different clean energy resources at their disposal. And I live in the West. I'm most familiar with the Western Interconnection, so I often, probably too much call on examples from this part of the country that I'm from. But the lesson of larger balancing areas and larger regions extends to other parts of the country, and having a bigger footprint and more diversity of resources in that footprint is going to help to accommodate higher penetrations of clean energy resources at a lower cost.
Great. Thank you, Carl. Another question that I think I can answer easily, we've had a number of people ask, not only for the presentation, which we, of course, will post, but also if we could make sure the links to all the different studies that Carl cited are also available so people can access those. There are a number of participants that would like to have copies of the various wind and renewable integration studies and others that you referenced, Carl. So we should try to we'll get those posted as well. So there are a couple of questions about, is there some sort of theoretical maximum of renewable energy penetration that would create some uncertainty about reliability? Hawaii has plans to go to 100% RPS. We've seen some discussion about 80% renewables. Is there some theoretical maxima here that would cause concern, or are these within the frame that these studies that have been done could accommodate?
So, so electric systems were built over the last, a lot of our infrastructure was built over the last 60 years. It was built for most of those years on the presumption that large, remote power plants, baseload power plants, would be the primary source of supply, and transmission infrastructure was built to support that, and the operating systems were built using the technology that was available, 50, 40 years ago. So the limitation in my mind is not on how high of a penetration can be theoretically reached. I think I personally believe that we could have 100% renewable energy provision someday, particularly when storage becomes very cost effective and well understood. And the electric system has evolved to the point where it can take advantage of all of the resources that we have available to us. Now, in the meantime, we bump into limits that have to do with the capabilities of the legacy system, and we can't change those things instantly. We also have to think about the ability of system operators to really change how they maintain reliability on the system. As with everything complicated that we do, we have rules of thumb that we rely on to complete those tasks, and system operators are no different. So there's we're talking about an institutional transition, technology transition where you're taking advantage of communications, control, and information technologies that haven't fully been utilized in the past. So we do bump into limits as far as how fast we can do this. And so Hawaii's example of setting a very hard target and moving towards that, is a goal that needs to be implemented with attention to how fast the operation of the system can be transitioned towards more storage, more use of customer resources, more taking advantage of the full range of capabilities that solar and wind resources can provide. And in that interim time, there's a need for a certain amount of conventional resources to ensure adequacy of supply. So I think that those interim limits are real and need to be paid attention to. Again, consulting with your favorite local engineers that you can trust and talk to about these things. But theoretical, as far as a theoretical limit, I don't see a theoretical limit. I just see a transition, and the question to me is how long does that transition take? And I'm not sure, but it's definitely not instant, and it has to happen over a number of years.
Great, thank you, Carl. This next question, I think, deepens what you had just mentioned. During your presentation, you talked about firm capacity requirements for wind and other variable generation, and used perhaps low penetration figures. If there is a rapid wind or solar development in a region, at what point do you have to consider building a gas generator?
Well, I think the first step in evaluating the capacity contributions of wind and solar is to use a methodology like effective load carrying capability to establish with real data how much those facilities are actually contributing to capacity. And in many places in the country that doesn't happen. So there is a problem of understating the contribution that renewable resources can make to capacity. Secondly, the point at which you get to do we need a gas generator is have we considered all of the capabilities and resources, all of the lower carbon capabilities and resources that are cost effective before we think about whether we need to add an additional gas generation unit. And that rarely happens, and so we have to think about how are we taking as full advantage of customer resources as we could. The customer resources that we talked about a little bit ago, the thermal storage capabilities that people who have electric water heaters with the right kind of electronics. People operate warehouses that have cold storage that can be moderated up and down to help to manage load. Have we set these, have we offered the opportunity for all of these resources and many more customer resources to meet the needs of the system or not? Whether we're in a planning paradigm where a utility is choosing which resources they're going to have available to respond, in which case all of these resources should be included in any kind of procurement or planning exercise to ensure that you've taken account of all of those that are truly available, to market environments where we need to ensure that resources that can provide energy, capacity, or capabilities like ancillary services and so forth are given the opportunity to be qualified to provide those resources, in other words, to bid into the market, and are evaluated fairly. So I think that's another step that one needs to go through. Another step one needs to go through is, are we taking advantage of all of the regional resources that we have available or not? Or, are we trying to be more, behave more like an island than we really are? So I think, after you do all those things, then if you identify that there is a residual need, or if you identify that the next step is an expensive one, then it's time to start thinking about where is a place on our system where we need to have additional gas generation to ensure reliability at this part of the transition.
Thank you, Carl. Okay, a question about a PJM study that requires, the PJM study says that additional transmission and other resources are needed to support renewable integration. One of NERC's main concerns was that it takes too much time to plan and add transition capacity and other infrastructure to integrate renewables by 2020. What card do we play to counter that claim?
Well, So recall that the PJM study was talking about reaching 30% renewables, which is not the target that's built into PJM. Trying to look for the Clean Power Plan, or not target, well, they call it target here. Maybe I don't know what the implicit target for PJM is in this list, but it looks like it's at most 25%. So the first question is how much transmission is in fact really needed to comply with the Clean Power Plan? Assuming that there is transmission needed, and assuming that there is uncertainty over the timing of that transmission, where you're short resources, I think the best strategy, in my opinion, is to call upon customer resources to the maximum extent possible in that interim period to cover whatever short-term deficiency might arise from a transmission line being delayed. If the transmission line is delayed by a couple of years, we know from studies done by the non-wires roundtable in the Northwest, it's not uncommon to find that there are local resource responses that can defer the need for transmission by a few years. My question would be, have we considered all of those mechanisms, all those options for deferring the transmission? In the investment in investing in those resources won't diminish the ultimate value of having the transmission completed and the generation delivered over that transmission. But I would say I would be quite surprised if there were not mitigation strategies that involve increased use of customer resources that couldn't be built in, that would have benefits not only for that transition period if there proves to be a short delay or even a several-year delay in the transmission, but will continue to have benefits far beyond, because the low-carbon system we're building toward is one that depends upon that kind of investment. So that's not a wasted investment.
Okay, thanks, Carl. Okay, next question. To the extent transmission constraints exist that preclude the integration of new renewables to an area, can the grid operator be required to fund transmission upgrades to improve the flow of renewables into an area?
So the answer to that question depends on where you are in the country. And I might call on Chris to answer for a different part of the country, but I'll just briefly answer for California that the attaining the renewable portfolio standard became a state goal that required that investment be made to ensure that that state goal could be met. So a lot of the transmission that was built within the state of California was paid for by all customers of the California ISO under the rationale that there was a public policy directive that had to be met, and those specific transmission projects were considered essential to meeting that goal. But maybe Chris can answer for a different part of the country.
Well, I remember in New England that there are some discussions discussions on socializing costs of different transmission improvements, for reliability. My own former state of Connecticut had a severe reliability issue in the southwest part of the state, and was able to get the transmission upgrade costs socialized throughout the 6 states. One could argue whether that was good public policy or not, but that certainly was the case that occurred. This is probably about 10 years ago now. So I think there probably are such opportunities, and it depends upon what region of the country you're situated in. Let's see. There's a couple other questions here. Okay, so here's one. What reliability metrics would you recommend to use when analyzing the deployment of renewable energy resources?
I'll give you a couple of the, let's see, I'll give you a couple of the, metrics. I can't answer off the top of my head. I myself am not an engineer, and so you're stepping into an area that I'm less comfortable in. But I would say generally that one reliability, as far as a reliability metric, systems have established, planning reserve margins that are based upon some planning standard, like 1 outage in 10 years, or 1 day in 10 years, or 1 event in 10 years, something like that standard, which leads to the development of a planning reserve number. Interesting study done by the Brattle Group in PJM recently found that those planning reserves, and 15% used to be a common number used for a planning reserve. If you had 15% planning reserves, then you're reliable. And some said, well, some say that, well, with more variable energy on the system, we need a higher planning reserve because we can't really, quote unquote, count on those resources. So there's 2 sides to that, 2 metric sides to this question. First of all, establishing a planning reserve that is realistic given the current situation is an important metric to focus on. And the Brattle Group actually found that they believed that the planning reserve margin, despite all the wind that's on the system in Texas, in ERCOT, could be reduced to 11% and maintain reliability. So one metric to think about is a planning reserve metric, and making sure that that metric is established well. A second metric is, the capacity that all resources provide towards meeting that planning reserve metric. And I talked before about effective load carrying capability, and ensuring that your utility or your system operator has actually done the modeling to reflect the effective load carrying capability of their wind and solar resources on the system. And also ensure that, as I said before, that customer resources, demand response, storage, distributed generation that can be brought into play to contribute to resource adequacy, that those things are being taken into account. So I'd say a second metric to pay attention to is the capacity credit of different resources, different clean energy resources, and is that adequately reflected? I'm not going to attempt to answer the other the other planning metrics question. What I will do again, or reliability metrics question, there's this thing called CPS1 and CPS2 people use to measure the reliability of the system. But what I will do is point you again, and I'll include this in this bibliography of resources to which I referred in this presentation, to Deborah Liu's presentations, where she went through frequency response, loss of inertia, ramping requirements, and distributed, distribution, local distribution limits. She went through systematically each one of these aspects of reliability, and embedded within that presentation are metrics that you can turn to and how to evaluate whether those different conditions of reliability are met.
Okay, Carl, thank you very much. And I especially want to thank all the participants who stayed on with us for the full 90 minutes. We will have this recorded presentation available to those of you who want to listen again, or to any of your colleagues who may not have had a chance to listen to it live. Carl, any final points before we end the webinar?
No. Thank you all for attending, and please follow up with us if you want to talk more.
Great. Thank you all once again, and we look forward to seeing many of you in person. We will be at the neighborhood meetings starting Saturday and Sunday in D.C., so I'm sure there'll be many opportunities to follow up on the topics covered today. Thank you.